Greetings, everyone. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers, and I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. MFSA is a 100-year-old plus justice-seeking, faith-based policy and organizing network. Our mission is to mobilize, lead, and sustain a progressive United Methodist movement, energizing people to be God's agent of justice, peace, and reconciliation. We're honored to be co-hosting this series of webinars with our partner, United Methodist for Kairos Response, UMKR. UMKR is a movement for Palestinian human rights whose goal is freedom and justice and equality for all Palestinians and Israelis. To achieve that goal, United Methodist clergy and laity engage in boycott and divestment campaigns, political actions to change government policy, and education to help our church and society understand what is happening in the Holy Land and how we can support the Palestinian people in their liberation struggle. As Christians, the advocates in UMKR believe that God has called us all to this justice-seeking, peacemaking work. A few announcements concerning our call today. We are currently all on mute. And so you won't have the ability to unmute yourselves, but you can say hello in the chat. Our webinars are a place to learn, be challenged, and be in community together. We seek to create an equitable and brave space, and one where we treat each other with respect and dignity. We are recording, and the recording will be shared in the coming days. We'll share more information at the end of the call about that. And as you have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box. There will be a point where we'll turn off the ability for folks to chat with everybody so that we can focus on our conversation today. But you can still send those questions into the host. And closed captioning is available. It's automatically generated. So expect some spelling errors. It's not perfect, but we do have that available. I would like to invite us to take a pause for a moment and to remember those who died in Buffalo at the hands of a white supremacist extremist who acted out of a system of oppression that causes violence and harm to all of us, white supremacy. And I invite you to offer your own words of prayer in the chat. This individual believed in something called replacement theory, something that we have a responsibility to resist and speak out against it and its normalization that it seems to be happening in our politics and society today. We also mourn Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, who was killed by Israeli forces last week. She was wearing garments that clearly identified her as press, and she was armed with a camera, as one Israeli military person described her. She was targeted as dozens of other journalists have been targeted by Israel to stop their powerful truth-telling. And Shireen's truth-telling was particularly powerful. She was an iconic and irreplaceable voice for Palestinians. And there are more and more incidents of violence, more than I can mention on this call. We lift them up in the chat in our prayers. We, as humanity who share this home that we call Earth, together with all of creation, are responsible for each other and responsible to each other. It is part of what we do here in our work at MFSA, UMKR, and the webinars that we do together. We gather in community, we share our stories, we hear the stories of our neighbors, and we dare to dream and imagine a better future. I'm blessed to do this work of liberation and resistance in community with all of you. The work we do together matters, and we're just grateful that we all get to be a part of that, and we thank you for being a part of that. I'm going to now turn our conversation over to our moderator today, Teresa. Teresa is the communications director for UMKR. She is also currently serving as on the board of FOSNA, Friends of Sabeel North America, and as a former member of the steering committee of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. We welcome Teresa.
Thanks very much, Bridget. And it's great to see you all here. Thanks for joining us. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our wonderful panelists. I just want to mention again that something that Bridget told us, that we would like to receive questions from you, and you can submit them in the chat column, but you will only be able to contact one of the hosts to send a message to one of the hosts. And we ask that you send your questions to MFSA. That's Bridget. Bridget will collect any of the questions that you might suggest for the panelists. And near the end of the hour, we will take a look at those questions and bring at least a couple of them to the panelists. Okay, so let's meet our excellent panelists. We have with us Nada Elia. Nada is a diaspora Palestinian writer, grassroots organizer, and a university professor. She is the author of Trances, Dances, and Vociferations, Agency and Resistance in Africana Women's Narratives. And she has contributed chapters to The Case for Sanctions Against Israel, Palestine, A Socialist Introduction, and Arab and Arab American Feminisms. Her upcoming book, Greater Than the Sum of Our Parts, Palestine, Feminism, Internationalism, will be published this fall by Pluto Books. Her articles have been published in Middle East Eye, Mondo Weiss, and numerous other publications. Nada is a core member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective and has been a plenary presenter at such national conferences as U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights and Students for Justice in Palestine. Welcome, Nada.
Thank you for having me.
And we also have with us Ido Conrad. Ido is the editor-in-chief of 972 magazine, an Israeli digital publication known for its justice-oriented reporting with in-depth analysis and commentary on current events in Israel, Palestine, and the world. He is based in Tel Aviv and previously worked as an editor at Haaretz. Ido studied international relations at UCLA, and he has been published in The Daily Beast, Common Dreams, Jewish Currents, Electronic Intifada, Push Shalom, and many others. Under his leadership, 972 magazine has embraced an identity that is intersectional, progressive, and that centers the experiences and demands of vulnerable communities on the ground. They are challenging the pillars of apartheid in Israel, Palestine, and unpacking Zionism as a settler colonial project. So welcome, Ido.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you both. So let's get into it now. I think that it would be safe to say, it would be a given that we can agree on, that all of us here see Russia's invasion of Ukraine as both brutal and unjustified. And that would be the case even if we add caveats about possible provocations of Russia since the breakup of the Soviet Union, provocations by the US, the NATO military alliance, etc. And that certainly holds true in spite of any of the propaganda and misinformation that Russia has put out about the reasons for their invasion. We have been watching in horror as entire cities have been destroyed in Ukraine, and millions are fleeing for their lives. We have seen brave civilians joining the fight for their homeland, and many of us have wanted to help them, and as have so many millions around the world. So when we question, as we will in this webinar, the nature of the support we are seeing for Ukraine, and then we make comparisons to the world's support, or lack of it, for other populations in dire need, we are not begrudging the Ukrainians the support they are getting. Our sympathy and our solidarity is not a zero-sum game. We can hold more than one people in our hearts and stand in solidarity with them concurrently, even as we examine the injustices that are being meted out to others. Those of us who are fighting, not militarily, but in other ways, for an oppressed and beleaguered people, namely the Palestinian people, have been struck by the extraordinary responses we're seeing in the US and Europe to what is happening in Ukraine, and the glaring disparities when we compare those responses to the attitudes of the same countries and the same societies regarding Israel and regarding the Palestinian people. Some of those remarkable and disturbing responses would be a righteous and unending indignation at this truly unwarranted aggression by Russia, admiration for Ukraine's military response and enormous military support for that, strong endorsement of noble civilian resistance fighters, deep sympathy and material support for refugees, and strong support for their determination to return to Ukraine. Powerful and some might say perhaps even overly punitive economic actions, including US and European government sanctions, boycotts by businesses, divestment actions by individual US states, and many more actions, all having strong support from the public. Outrage over the attacks on civilian targets by Russia, such as apartment buildings that have been destroyed. Calls for charges to be brought against Russia for war crimes. And broader permissions that we are seeing social media permit Ukrainians regarding the type of messaging they post, including angry and even violent speech. So, turning to our panelists now, I'd like to ask you if you could share with us some of the most egregious examples of these double standards and hypocrisy that you have seen. What has really struck you the hardest? And specifically, of course, in comparison to what we know has been happening and not been done for the Palestinians and what policies are regarding Israel. So I'd like to direct that question to Nada first. And Nada, as you share which things have seemed to you some of the most egregious examples, could you also share a little bit of what you've written recently about how this has struck you personally as a Palestinian woman, the effect it's had on you, and any evolution in your feelings about this over the last 2 months?
Sure. So basically, I mean, what you've just listed, many of the things you've just listed are some of the most egregious examples. I'm watching the news every day, and every day I see scenes that remind me of Palestine. And as I see these scenes, I mean, I thought your introduction was great. I really appreciate what you just said, that, you know, as I see these scenes and I think of Palestine, I'm like, there's a part of me that goes, yes, absolutely. This is really, really, really savage, unwarranted, criminal, murderous. It's violent war. And why is it that that is represented and not Palestine? So the piece that I wrote recently, one of the most recent pieces I wrote about Ukraine and the situation there, which I actually titled Bitter, because that's all I could feel at the time. I wrote an essay called Bitter, which it started out as simply a social media post. I'm like, I'm bitter about this. I'm bitter about this. And then I published it as an essay. But what I want to say is when I posted that essay where I speak about my bitterness, I immediately got lots and lots of emails from people I knew and people I didn't know, primarily Palestinians, who said that my essay reflected their exact feelings. And so when I say that, it wasn't my feeling as much as it was an overall Palestinian feeling. It wasn't individual, it was Palestinian. And even though Palestinians are actually we're very used to being vilified by the Western media. We're very used to being criminalized for our very existence. But at the same time, it's like just seeing what reminds us of our home with the huge difference was really bad. I mean, there is at the same time that Russia was attacking Ukraine, it's not something in the past. I mean, we've just celebrated the Nakba, commemorated the Nakba, and the Nakba is not an event in the past. We are commemorating our 74th Nakba because the Nakba is ongoing. Today, as I speak, there is ethnic cleansing going on. Today, as I speak, Israel is dispossessing people in Sheikh Jarrah, in Masafir Yatta, in the Nakam. Children are being kidnapped, they're being tortured, innocent civilians are being imprisoned. This is happening now. And so the fact that some very, very egregious things are happening now at a time when the world is aware of that and expressing outrage over that somewhere else actually really added insult to injury. But I want to say it added insult to injury, but the injury is there anyway, whether the insult is there or not. So, so it's really, you know, I wrote about how bitter it felt. And I would say, you know, I don't want to just be bitter. I want to say, you know, there's something that needs to be done. I hate to hijack and piggyback on other causes, but the fact is, if that's how we can bring attention to Palestine, then I will bring attention to Palestine, because there's not enough attention to Palestine. This, you know, as I said, dispossession, displacement, murder, killing, war, attack, occupation, all of these things are going on. And again, the extreme, you know, discrepancy is that, again, as I said, it's not something that happened in the past. It is ongoing. It is ongoing today as I speak, and it is not being reported. Or if it is reported, it's reported in this completely distorted narrative that blames the Palestinians for trying to stay alive.
Thank you. That was very powerful. I really appreciate hearing your feelings and how much that reflects so many other Palestinians. I can imagine the flood of responses that you would have gotten at that point after you wrote that. Ido, what are your thoughts about some of the these double standards and hypocrisy we're seeing? Is anything leaped out at you in particular? And when you're answering that, could you also speak a little bit about the reactions that you're seeing on the ground there in Israel among Israelis, in Israel, Palestine among Palestinians and Israelis?
Sure. I mean, I think Nada really covered it. The hypocrisy is just so glaring, that the world's attention is so starkly focused on Ukraine, as it should be. And when it comes to Palestine and what's happening to the Palestinians, people they can't really tell who's the oppressor and who's the oppressed. You know, Israel has been, for 74 years, been able to really distort the story and tell its own story of who is doing the oppressing and who is doing and who is being oppressed. And I think you really see that reflected in the way that Israelis here view the war in Ukraine, the war on Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, and they view themselves as, they identify themselves with the Ukrainians, you know, and this is just, it's a testament to really how distorted, you know, this kind of understanding of ourselves is as Israelis. The vast majority of Israelis, according to polls, really do support Ukraine, but they also, I think, by extension, they see what's happening in Ukraine and they say, well, we have no one to rely on but ourselves. Just like the Ukrainians, no one's coming to the aid of the Ukrainians. And that is a lesson to Israelis that, well, we have to fight for ourselves because we are under, you know, either threat of invasion, constantly under threat of invasion, under threat of war, when in fact Israel is the one that raids and invades Palestinian refugee camps, Palestinian cities on a daily basis. Israel is the one that, you know, came to the Middle East, came to Palestine, and essentially kicked out an indigenous people and brought a settler community here to establish a new state on the backs of another people. And so it's, you know, on the one hand, it's infuriating. And on the other hand, you know, I live among Israelis. I'm an Israeli and I live in Israeli society. And it boggles the mind to try and really understand how warped your understanding of reality needs to be, and how much denial you need to be living in. Really, I think the denial, it's deeply saddening to me. And I know that it's deeply infuriating, and I'm sure Nada can talk at length at that and the bitterness that arises from that. But even if you're just like a spectator from the side, you know, like I can imagine someone totally unrelated to what's happening here, watching what's happening, saying the amounts of deep denial that it takes to not only continue with this process of dispossession and ethnic cleansing and dehumanization of Palestinians, but also to identify yourself with another people's who is undergoing a similar process whilst you are carrying it out. It's you know, it sometimes just leaves me without words. So I try to write and encourage other people to write so that we can kind of speak truth to power on that.
And that's it's a gift to us that you do. Thank you. I want to expand on that a bit then, Ido. You wrote this year about this fact that Israelis are very sympathetic to the Ukrainians. If you think it makes no sense for Israel to be identifying with the Ukrainians, perhaps then it's actually Russia and the Russians that a better analogy could be made to. Would you agree with that? And if so, what would that analogy be? What are the similarities that you could identify for us succinctly about what Russia is doing and what Israel is doing or has done, or both?
Yeah, I mean, I do want to clarify. It's not that it boggles the mind because it's just so hard to grasp on an emotional level. But when you see how deeply inculcated people are, how deeply inculcated Jewish Israeli society is to believe a very particular narrative of, victimization, kind of no matter what, and in very, very rare circumstances, admitting that you're not necessarily a victim, but that victimization kind of undergirds the processes that create the kind of national consciousness that allows dispossession and occupation to happen. It's easier to understand why that happens. It doesn't make it any less painful for me to see it, or any less troubling. Yeah, look, I mean, I don't like doing the one-to-one comparisons and saying the Ukrainians are the Palestinians and the Israelis are the Russians. I'm not sure that that's necessarily helpful. But, there are similarities. Russia using enormous amounts of ammunition, cluster bombs, destroying entire cities that we see in Mariupol, besieging entire cities the same way. You might make a comparison to the way that Israel works in Gaza, the kind of mass kind of extermination of a local population, or massacres happening that we saw in Bucha happen in Ukraine, that you can compare to some of the large-scale massacres that happened in the Nakba in 1948 and following the Nakba and in 1967. So you can make a lot of these kind of one-to-one comparisons. The cluster bombs that Israel used in the 70s and 80s in Lebanon and in the 1973 war, now Russia is allegedly using. But the list goes on and on, right? Killing journalists. We can make these comparisons. I think what's interesting is to actually, there are these small differences that, again, they're not they might be small, they might be large, but they're not to excuse any single side's behavior, but to show how the different sides, what conditions each side is working under. If you're talking about the Russians have just inverted reality completely. They're treating Ukraine like a country that needs to be liquidated. Its elite needs to be liquidated. Its army needs to be liquidated. Its people either need to be kicked out or cowed completely. And it treats itself like it sees itself as an empire and at the same time a victim of Ukrainian nationalism. And it really doesn't, it uses those tactics and that discourse to, I think, really create a sense that there is no regard for anyone in any way, any civilians, nothing. It doesn't matter. It is pure carnage as far as the Russians are concerned. I think the Israelis are actually much more concerned about their image. It sometimes doesn't seem that way, but I think Israel will do everything it can to keep this very delicate balancing act and show the world, even in the case of, let's take the case of the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh a few days ago, the journalist. It will say, maybe there's a chance that she was caught in the crossfire, and there's a chance that she was killed by Israeli forces. There's a good chance that she was killed by a Palestinian gunman. We'll never know, we'll never know, and we'll just keep throwing all of this noise into the system to create a whodunit situation, and eventually, maybe years down the line, someone will find out. We'll have some conclusive evidence to what happened, as opposed to Russia. And I think Russia just doesn't care about so much about what the world thinks of its image at this point. It's built this mass alliance with other countries, economic alliances with other countries, that it can continue doing these things. So that does not to excuse Israel's behavior in any way, but I think it does inform the different way in which those two actors behave. I think if there was one kind of common similarity between the two, and I'd love to hear Nada's thoughts about this, because I'm sure she has a lot to say, is that the complete denial of Ukrainian nationalism, Ukrainian national identity, Ukrainian sovereignty, is I think those are the kind of, that's the immediate parallel for me. The Israel's denial of Palestinian identity, Palestinian sovereignty. At least Ukraine has had a country, sovereign borders, and an army. Since 1948, Israel has basically created a situation in which Palestinian sovereignty at best is a dream that may come true, may come to fruition in the future through some peace process. But that's kind of at the core of I think the parallels that I see.
Okay. Thank you. That was pretty comprehensive, and thank you for also pointing out the distinctions. Nada, I'm sure Ido is right. You have thoughts about this.
I have a lot about that. I was jotting down things here. It's like, and I didn't jot down enough, but I have a lot to say. I want to agree, disagree, and add to what Ido was saying. The first one, I mean, I thought the point of the narrative of victimization is really important, that the Israeli Zionist narrative of victimization, and how some a majority of Israelis really do view themselves as the victim. Yes, but what's interesting is that the rest of the Western world has also bought into that narrative of victimization. So it's not just the Israelis who misperceive themselves as victims, because they are not the victims. They are the occupying power. They are the settler colonial country. They are the ones engaging in massacres. They are the ones killing journalists. They are the ones dispossessing Palestinians. They are the ones displacing, engaging in ethnic study. They are the ones doing that, and yet they view themselves as victims. But what I find interesting is how much the Western media has also bought that narrative. And so, the Russians view themselves as victims of Ukraine, but the rest of the world doesn't exactly see that. Whereas what we have, which is different from the Ukraine, is mainstream Western media, left and right, if we can speak of the left, views Israel as the victims. The way it is, Israel is always responding, Israel is always retaliating, as if Israel were not the primary aggressor. Who's occupying who? Who's displacing who? Who's engaging in ethnic cleansing of who? And so for me, what I find most mind-boggling is not so much the narrative of victimizations that Zionist Israelis have, but that this narrative of victimization has been so accepted unquestioningly and uncritically by Western media, by the mainstream Western media. That to me is like, what's going on? How is it? And what I want to say is, obviously, yes, racism is absolutely at the very core of that. We're talking about a European, primarily European people against an Arab people. And so racism comes in. The racism here, I'm going to make a comparison to what's going on in the Ukraine, because basically I saw that you posted my articles in the chat, and in the second one that I published in Middle East Eye, I'm actually quoting. I'm going to look at it right now. I quote. Where is it? I quote someone who said. Wait, where is it? For me, it was like, oh my gosh, how can anyone be so absolutely openly and uncritically racist? So it was an article that says, times like now, when a foreign power has staged the first European land grab in nearly 80 years, we want a voice. The first European land grab in nearly 80 years, we want a voice, right? It's like, because it's a European land grab, that's what matters. That now it's a European country. There's been land grabs for the past 74 years in Palestine. There's been land grabs all over the world, but not in Europe. And so the racism, and as I said, the uncritical racism, someone who can actually not think twice about how this is going to fall on people, on readers who are not European. This is the first European land grab in 80 years. And so we want a voice. We want to support Ukraine. We want to, that to me was mind-boggling. And again, it's even odd to speak of being flabbergasted when this has been our reality for 74 years. But for me, that crystallizes the racism behind, the outrage over Ukraine, but not over Palestine, and the support of Israel, but not of the Palestinian people. This is the first European land grab in 80 years. And then I was talking to some people and they said, but actually, it's not just that it's the first European, it's that it's going to have regional repercussions. And I'm like, excuse me, Palestine does not have regional repercussions, but the region is not Europe. And so, how do we prioritize? Palestine has had Israel's occupation of Palestine, Israel's taking over Palestine, is the displacement of the Palestinians has had regional repercussions, very major regional, and I would even say global repercussions for over 74 years. So speaking of the Ukraine, it's a European land grab, yes, and it's going to have regional repercussions, yes. And what about Palestine? And again, there's the bitterness, as I say, of always having to say, what about Palestine, when Palestine should not have to be compared. It's an injustice. It's something really egregious in every sense of the word. And we don't have to compare, and we have to piggyback and on other causes to explain what is going on in Palestine. So as I said, I was jotting down things as Ido was speaking, the narrative of victimization, the fact that, and another thing that you said was that Israel is actually more concerned about its image. Yes, absolutely, Israel does engage in immense hasbara, but also Israel actually knows that it can get away with murder. Right. So it is concerned about its image, but it also knows that it will not be held accountable. It can get away with murder. And there's that going on too. Right. It gets away with murder over and over and over and over and over again. It's getting away with a genocide in Gaza. That is a genocide. Under every single definition of genocide, what is going on in Gaza is a genocide, and it's getting away with it. The murder of Shireen Abu Ali is a murder. It's getting away with it. So it's an odd thing where the victimization narrative is accepted. The image is very, very polished everywhere, even though it is actually getting away with documented murder. The third point that you mentioned that I also want to respond is Ukraine is a sovereign state, Palestine is not a sovereign state, and Palestinians have been plagued with this idea that we are not a sovereign state, ever since, for 74 years. But what's interesting is that, even that is also a racist, Eurocentric concept, because, so what if we were never recognized as a sovereign nation state? Does that mean that the native indigenous people of this country who were not recognized as a native sovereign state, according to a concept that actually is a relatively recent European concept? You cannot retroactively fit it on some people who are not there, So, the concept of the nation state is a concept that came out of Europe in the 19th century. Does that mean that anyone who does not believe in that concept is not a people, is not a nation, does not have rights? But basically, when Golda Meir said the Palestinians never existed, that's exactly what she meant. The Palestinians never existed as a UN recognized, a European recognized nation state, with all of the, what are the accoutrements of a European nation state. And therefore, because they were not recognized as that, then they didn't exist. That, again, as I said, we've been plagued with that charge from the beginning, because we're not a recognized sovereign state, therefore we're not occupied, we're not displaced, we're not dispossessed. That's a very, very, very racist idea. It's, again, the only comparison I would say is all of the nations that lived in Turtle Island on this continent prior to the settler colonial occupation of this land, of the Americas, north to south. Did they not exist? They weren't nation states. Most of them to this day are not nation states. Are they not dispossessed? Was there not a genocide here? Do you have to recognize a nation state in the European sense to acknowledge that there's an injustice? And yes, of course, Israel being racist at its very, very, very core will of course say they didn't exist. Just like the settler colonials coming here being racist at their very core, or they would not have created a country here that is a European country that speaks English and practices Christianity primarily. But the lack of recognition of the humanity of someone because they don't fit retroactively through a cookie cutter under the concept of nation state is racist at its very core. And so what we are seeing in the Palestinian situation is the celebration of racism.
Thank you. That's very powerful. I can tell that Ido agreed very strongly with what you were saying. And I think I will just put words in his mouth that he was speaking for what others might claim regarding Palestine not being a sovereign state, not his own personal.
Yeah, as I said, I'm just
yeah.
adding to what he was saying. It's like
Yeah, exactly. But it was very well made, and something that I haven't heard mentioned often enough, actually. I love the analogy you made to indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, North America. I would just add my own last comment before we move on to the next subject about, how we do not accept Russia's propaganda, in Hebrew, hasbara, and we do so completely, so widely in the mainstream media and in Western governments. We accept Israel's propaganda, Israel's version of things, but that has so much to do with years and decades of laying the groundwork for that.
Can I say one thing in response to that?
Yes, sure.
I think we would be remiss if we erased decades of incredible organizing led by Palestinians against these things, and that I think there is a shift in the way that the world sees Israel, despite Israel's great efforts. And I'm talking about the world as in people, not governments and leaders, but there is a shift that we're seeing among even take American Jews, who are historically very, very supportive of they're liberal, but they're very, very supportive of Israel. Last year, a poll showed that 25% of American Jews think that Israel is an apartheid state. That's a huge number, and it's not to be discredited, and it's probably mostly because social media and the broadcasting of kind of Israel's aggression on TV, blatant for everyone to see, has helped change that perception. But it's also because Palestinians have been leading decades of counter hasbara, like our truth telling about what's actually happening and what happened to their families in 48 and what happened in 67 and what happens in the occupied territory since. And before you were saying that, the narrative, the pro-Israel narrative, the hasbara narrative is so strong. What's even more enraging is that I've encountered so many people, diplomats, people who won't speak on record, but who know the truth. That's the thing. A lot of people do know the truth. They're either scared to say something about it because of the repercussions. I think mostly it's just fear. They're generally just scared to speak out. All these people who ambassadors and diplomats who work in Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, who are overlooking the site of one of the central sites of dispossession, one of many, but one of the central sites of dispossession in Palestine. And the best they can do is offer these kind of these apologies and light condemnations, and we have to stop these things, but they won't actually put their jobs on the line. They won't actually speak out in their own names, and that's, I think, what's even more infuriating. So there is this thing that people do know on the one hand, and amazing activism that is really kind of shifting the tide, and we saw that, I think, very pronounced last year in May, that there was this shift, and it's happening. It's going to continue happening, and there's going to be setbacks, and there will be more setbacks, and there will be victories and more victories. But I just didn't want it to come off as like pure brainwashing. The world has bought into this thing, and we're all, and there's just the three of us and the rest of the people in this chat room who know the truth. Like there's a lot of activism going on, and I would just, we'd be remiss to not mention that, I think.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad you said that, because that is not a focus that is heard enough. And indeed, it is true, and we need to keep hearing it, that we are making an impact, the Palestinians in particular, and many partners and allies around the world, after so many years of activism, of pushing against that wall. We are seeing some progress, not nearly fast enough, and there's huge suffering still in Palestine, but there is progress being made. All right, I'm going to jump to what I see is actually our biggest topic here, and skip over one of the questions that I had suggested to you both. The big question for us that I'd like us to consider now is what lessons can we be learning from what we've been seeing happen, everything we've just been discussing about these disparities between attitudes toward Ukraine and Russia and Israel, Palestine, and the extraordinary responses of support, in particular, boycott, divestment, and sanctions actions to support Ukraine. We've seen so much of it, it's just been astonishing. Severe sanctions on Russia, cutting off access to banking services, cutting off the purchase of their natural resources. Individual US states that are divesting from Russian companies, some of the very same states that have passed laws to punish or criminalize BDS action in solidarity with Palestinians. Boycott actions by companies, large and small businesses that are refusing to do business with Russia or to sell their products. One of the most remarkable and most recent actions, McDonald's has announced they are selling 850 restaurants in Russia, just completely removing their presence after decades of building up that franchise there. And this involves the jobs of over 60,000 people. So this is going to be crushing to a lot of Russians. And so many other actions. There are way too many to name, but many analysts and commentators have been noting the obvious bias here. The refusal of so many of the same actors and certainly of the governments to support any economic actions like this for the Palestinian people. So Nada, I'd like to ask you first. You did write recently in that article you just referred to that you think that this flood of BDS-type responses to the Russian aggression should be used by activists now to galvanize the Palestinian-led BDS movement. Can you unpack for us, elaborate on the conditions that you are saying that you think that could make that possible and how you could see that happening?
Absolutely. I mean, again, in that article, my article was in some ways a response to that exceedingly racist article where he was like, oh, this is the first European land grab in over 80 years. And how do we respond? Well, we can respond with sanctions. It's like, so, I mean, that's the call that the Palestinians are making. That article does not mention McDonald's, but it's like, again, to contrast the differences, like McDonald's has pulled out of Russia. It took almost 15 years of organizing for Ben and Jerry's to pull out of the settlements. It's like, come on, really? I mean, the comparison, but I think if one can say that all of these actions against BDS actions, sanctions against, are not racist as much as they are support of the Ukrainian people, then one can also use that argument. This BDS is not anti-Semitic. I mean, much as Zionists really, really, really want to describe it as anti-Semitic, it isn't. It is a political strategy used by civilian people in order to also, I would say, primarily educate. I mean, one thing that I always say when I explain BDS is, you know, we could boycott every single Israeli product in every single grocery store, in every single state in the US. We would not make a dent in Israel's economy when we know what the US is giving Israel. And yet what we do when we speak of BDS is we're actually educating. I mean, Edo was speaking about the education that Palestinian activists have done. We're not in any way going to cripple the Israeli economy by not buying Sabra hummus. Really, we're not. If we were to make that impact, then the US president, any US president, Biden, Trump, whoever, would just sign an extra check. We're not impacting the Israeli economy. We're not hurting the Israeli people. We are educating. BDS is primarily for me an educational thing, right? It is the activism that we engage in. And so, okay, you're boycotting Russian products, you support McDonald's. Tell me why you would not support the boycott, Ben and Jerry's pulling out of their illegal settlements. For me, BDS is that, but also, I mean, if again, since we are comparing, since this panel is about the comparison with Ukraine, why is it that we can support sanctions against Russia, but we can't do that with it's like there's so much that can be. This is a moment, and as I've said it again, and I've said it, and I'm going to say it again. I hate the fact that we need to piggyback on other causes, but that's the sad reality of Palestine in the US, that we need to point out the discrepancies, the racism in not supporting us, right? If you want to, I mean, if you celebrate military resistance, armed struggle against Russia, you should at least accept armed struggle against Israel, right? However, I am someone who doesn't believe in armed struggle, even though it is actually legal for Palestinians to engage in armed struggle. Personally, I don't think it's going to work. I mean, the power dynamic, the power disbalance is so gigantic that I'd be an absolute idiot if I thought that we could win through armed struggle. We can win through BDS. So for all those people who would not support armed struggle, I mean, I think that your community, the Kairos community, is a non-violent community. You don't want to support armed struggle. Fine, that's your prerogative, even though it is the right of the Palestinian people to engage in armed struggle. You have an alternative, right? And I'm speaking beyond the Kairos community now. For all those who would say no to armed struggle, no to violence, no to whatever, even though it is never violence when it is resistance to an occupying power that is actually determined to kill you. It's not violence. It's like a woman scraping someone who's raping her. If there's a rapist and a woman scratches the rapist, is that violence? Anyway, so if you don't want to believe in that, here's the alternative, BDS, right? So, but to criminalize BDS is, again, it can only be racist, because we're not criminalizing BDS, we're supporting BDS. Not only are we supporting armed struggle in Ukraine, we're also calling for more sanctions. I mean, one thing is like, both right and left, and it's really hard for me to speak of the left in this government, in the US government, but on both sides, Republicans and Democrats are calling for more harsher sanctions on Russia. And yet we criminalize someone who actually does not want to buy Sabra hummus.
Thank you. Okay. Ido, do you have thoughts about this? What can we be learning for the movement, the solidarity movement with Palestinians, from what we've been seeing play out in the last 2 months and the world's response?
I mean, I second everything that Nada said. I agree wholeheartedly.
Can I, you know what, I'm sorry, I just realized I needed to say one thing here in response to what she said. And it was about our position on armed resistance. It's a tricky issue, and we've never even had a clear statement or policy in Kairos response, Kairos response, or other church movements that I'm aware of. But I will say that I have always been very careful, and I think there are many others in church circles who might have this approach, to make sure we never condemn or denounce other ways of resisting. We are well aware that if any people have the right to resist with arms, then all people have the right to do that. If any people have the right to liberate themselves that way, then all people do. It's not our place to condemn the choices that Palestinians make to liberate themselves. Okay. So go ahead, Ido. Now, Ido, I'm sorry I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No. I mean, I don't think I have much to add to what Nada said. I think I wholeheartedly agree. I think the power of first of all, I think that the sanctions on Russia, they give us in the West, they give us this sense of like, we're doing something and we just got to do anything right now, because it really is so dire. And so on the one hand, I understand the feeling like we need to do anything, but it often comes off as very sloppy. So, you know, McDonald's is going to boycott Russia, and 60,000 people will lose their jobs. And it's not really thought out. It's more like, let's just do anything right now because we are so we just don't have any strategy. And I actually think that BDS is a very well thought out strategy. You have a national committee based in Palestine that communicates with different organizations around the world, that vets different forms of boycotts and vets different organizations and makes decisions and talks on a regular basis about what is boycottable, whatever, sanctionable, or who isn't, or should we target individuals? Should we target companies? Should we target, these are ongoing dynamic conversations. And as Nada pointed out very, very, very nicely, the point is to force a conversation, to create a space in churches in the United States, among unions, in student groups, on campuses, at workplaces, to create a conversation first and foremost about the abuses against Palestinians and about Palestinian rights. And I think we're actually seeing that. It's a long game. And I think what the very short-sighted, whether or not we think it's morally just, as on a tactical and strategic level, the short-sighted, let's just sanction the heck out of everything we can in Russia, instead of having some kind of strategic conversation, what is actually going to be effective, is very, very different than the kind of conversation that Palestinians are having on BDS. And that's, if there is something that is inspiring, it is the fact that BDS is this grassroots movement that is in constant communication, is constantly rethinking and constantly re-strategizing and what works and what doesn't work. And I've seen it firsthand, you know, and heard about it from friends who are active in those circles. As for, you know, Palestinian resistance, it's far be it for me to, especially as an Israeli, to dictate to Palestinians the terms of their resistance. And I think I fall in line with what Nada was saying about believing that the power imbalance is so great, and that armed resistance, I don't think necessarily will have the desired outcome that the Palestinians who support it hope it will. But that's exactly why there is this thing that so many people can tap into and learn about and use and bring to their community, which is, nonviolent resistance.
Mhm.
Very good. Thank you both very much. Comprehensive answers. Okay, I am going to just take time for one question because we are so close to the end of this hour. And it's one that I received in the chat, actually. Maybe the most helpful one that we could ask. Similar a bit to what I just asked you, but worded in a different way. What kind of action would you recommend that we do to follow up in our communities, in our churches, to help lift the oppression and occupation of Palestine? And I would ask, is there ways in what we're seeing right now happening that we can be specific about what actions we might be able to take now? And I do want to mention to anyone else who has sent me a private message in the chat, I wasn't able to respond to them. Our questions needed to go to MFSA. Sorry about that. So can you recommend actions for us now in our communities or in our movements, congregations? Any thoughts about that?
I think this panel, Ukraine, Palestine, is already an example of what happens. I mean, I would like to see at every protest about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, also Palestine, like side by side. And again, starting the conversation, because primarily it is the cultivated ignorance about what's going on in Palestine that allows Israel to get away with what it does. You know, there's been 74 years of Hasbara, there's been 74 years of lies, there's been 74 years of misrepresentation, and that has to end. And it can end with, you know, every time there, donate to Ukraine and Palestine, speak about Ukraine and Palestine. And if anyone asks questions, and they will ask questions, then explain. Are you against occupation? Are you against settler colonialism? Are you against the killing of civilians? Are you against, well, that is what's going on. And if they have follow-up questions, we have the follow-up answers. It's not like we don't know what's going on in Palestine. We do know. We have documentation. We can show the horrific videos of Israel bombing Palestine. And without a single one of Palestine, you know, demolishing entire buildings in civilian neighborhoods in Israel. That's, you know, it's easy. I mean, there's so much documentation of Israel's crimes that we should be able to respond, to answer questions when those questions are asked. And the questions will be asked if we actually point out the similarities.
So I'm hearing use every opportunity we have now, every venue we have, make these comparisons, educate people. You were saying a couple times earlier, you don't want to piggyback on someone else's suffering or some other issue, but we need to use what we can use. So use the opportunities we have now to point out to people, do you realize if you're outraged by this, you should be outraged by this?
Yeah, and of course, I mean, as Ida was pointing out, as all of us know, we've been doing this education before February 2022. So it's not like, you know, it's like we don't need Ukraine, but for anyone who is motivated by Ukraine, we can also use that. But we've been talking about occupation and BDS and settler colonialism and apartheid before Russia invaded Ukraine. So yes, now is a moment, now is an opportunity, but we can also speak without. But I think your question is, what do we do now? Mm-hmm. Now we point to the similarities.
Ido, do you have some thoughts on it?
I mean, I agree with that. I think as an Israeli, as a Jew, as a non-Palestinian, and as someone who is in solidarity with Palestinians, platforming Palestinians, giving Palestinians the microphone, giving Palestinians a stage where they've been shut out effectively for so long. I think, you know, I mentioned earlier this shift that's happening. Only I think really like in the last year has there been this, I won't call it a major shift, but a big shift in which Palestinians are finally being invited to CNN, finally being invited to MSNBC, finally being, and still, you know, they are also inviting pro-Israel voices. This isn't, I don't want to not have any illusions about this. But in a much bigger way, we are seeing Palestinians having a seat at the table, having the microphone. This, of course, is something we need to keep doing. You know, this is something that we need to keep amplifying. It can be reversed. This is something that hopefully won't be a blip, but we need to continue to fight to platform Palestinian voices. We published a piece on 972 a few years ago. I can drop it in the chat by a Palestinian academic named Maha Nassar, who actually did a study here. I'll put it in there now. Who did a study in which she looked at the way in which mainstream American newspapers, New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Republic, and even the Nation, the number of times, the percentage in which Palestinians were platformed and given either like an op-ed or analysis columns in those publications, and the numbers are abysmal. She went back to the 1970s, from 1970 until 2019, and yes, there is slight increases in percentages, but the numbers are just so so disheartening to see. And the answer to that is that we just need to do better. People need to be reaching out to Palestinians, to listen to Palestinians, and if they have opportunities, bring Palestinians to speak at their churches, bring Palestinians to speak at the synagogue, bring Palestinians to speak anywhere that they can about what's happening.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Great closing.
Sure.
I just want to add,
Yeah, go ahead.
I happen to know Maha personally, and her latest article was published only 2 days ago. And I just posted it in the chat, and it's why speaking about clashes is misleading. The very fact that we speak of what's going on in Palestine as clashes. I mean, Maha is a media specialist. That's what she does. She's a professor of media, and her analysis is always about the media. And so this one, media reports of clashes mislead about Israeli-Palestinian violence. So yes, I mean, more Palestinian voices, puncturing, rupturing, disrupting, debunking the Israeli narrative is very important. Yes.
Thank you. That's a perfect close.
Clashes going on. That's a war.
Yeah, but that's a perfect close. We need to center Palestinian voices more and more. Capitalize on the shift that we are seeing. Make sure it continues. Don't take it for granted, and work on getting more and more of it, and use the tools we have at the moment, such as the current narrative about Ukraine. Thank you very much, all of you. It's been a privilege being in conversation with you. I appreciate you making the time for this, and I'm sure everyone else here does. And we could go on with this for a lot longer. Perhaps we'll do it again sometime in the future. I hope so. But now I'm going to wrap this up and turn this back over to Bridget of MFSA, who will close us out.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much to our speakers. As we've mentioned in the chat, we will be sharing the recording of the webinar. You can find them on both of our websites and YouTube channels. And I do want to share about something that was mentioned in the conversation today. We have another webinar series, The Doctrine of Discovery. It is called Stealing the Earth, the Conquering of Indigenous Peoples, the Role of Christianity and What Can Bring About Justice. You can watch previous recordings of it. We are having our last session, May 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern. Our last session is entitled Undoing the Doctrine, Developing a Theology of Repentance and Repair. And if you're unfamiliar with the Doctrine of Discovery, it's based on a series of 15th century papal bulls. It's a body of international law developed by European powers at the beginning of the colonial project. And it basically stated that any undiscovered, unchristian land could be claimed by the European power that discovered it. And this was the legal justification for stealing lands from First Peoples all over the world, and very much tied to Palestine as well, and is also the basis for white supremacy, imperialism, colonialism. It's a very important conversation, and we hope that you join us. I will drop that information in the chat as well. And you're welcome to come, even if you haven't been to the other previous calls. So join us. There's also recordings of the previous ones as well. Thank you again for joining us. We will have another UMKR MFSA webinar in July. Did I get that right, Teresa?
Yes.
In July, okay. In July, and we'll be sending out information about that very soon. So thank you all again for joining us.